Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Okay. My screen is also visible, right?
Yes, sir.
So basically, today and tomorrow, I'm going to complete a database first approach, right? So most of the concept we have covered. Today, I'm going to discuss how to work with the storage procedure, storage functions, and views. Tomorrow, I'm going to discuss how to work with the transactions and a few more small concepts, right? And then from Monday, we are going to start our code first approach. So let's start today's session. Let us start to discuss with the first. Let us first try to understand what is storage procedure, right? How to create storage procedure and what exactly entity framework does with storage procedure and how we can execute a storage procedure using entity framework. Can anybody tell me what is a storage procedure from a database point of view or from a SQL Server point of view? Any idea from anyone?
Well, it's a precompiled script which runs in the server and is saved in the server.
Right. So
So the how do you call that? The execution plan is already solved and everything is ready to go.
absolutely right. So storage procedure basically you can consider it's a database object. So guys, whenever I'm saying database object means it is physically stored in the database, right? If you go to the database server, right, and if you expand so table, if you expand table, so you can see these are the tables. That means it's a database object, right? If you open view, you will see this is one database object, right? And whichever, and if you go to programmability and storage procedure folder, and you can see these are our storage procedure. Whichever you can see physically, right? Inside your database, it is nothing but one database object, right? So storage procedure is also a database object, and you can see these are nothing but your storage procedure, and these are nothing but your code for the storage procedure, right? These are so as you can compare the storage procedure, right, with your function. What is a function? A function contains a group of statements, and whenever called, those statements, whatever defined inside the function, are going to be executed. Similar thing, what is storage procedure? Storage procedure is also a block of statements, and whenever called, those statements are going to be executed. Like function, right? As you know, inside a .NET function, you can pass some input parameter, you can pass some output parameter. Function might be written something, function might not be written something, right? The same thing is also applicable inside your storage procedure, right? So your function can take some input parameter, function can take your storage procedure can take some input parameter, storage procedure might be take some output parameter, storage procedure might be return some data or might not be return some data, right? So you can see in this case it is returning a collection, I mean it's a table, right? So in this case it is returning a scalar value, in this case it is not returning anything, right? So you can see in this case it is taking one parameter. In this case it is taking three parameter. Here four parameter and here one parameter. Right. Later, later I will show you. Guys, give me 1 minute. right? So you can see in this case, I'm not creating any storage procedure with the output parameter, but after some time, I'm also going to show you how to create storage procedure with both input and output parameters, right? So you can compare, this is nothing but one function, right? And guys, remember what exactly this? These nothing but pre-compiled SQL queries, right? So what will happen now whenever you create this statement, right? Whenever you execute this statement, one storage procedure is going to be created. So you can see in the left hand side. So what are these? Right? So these are nothing but your storage procedure, right? What exactly this storage procedure content? What exactly this SP delete student content? This SP delete student, right, going to contain this statement. Na? What is this statement? This is a pre-compiled SQL query. What do you mean by pre-compiled SQL query? Now, this whenever you execute this statement, whatever statement you have written, that is compiled and that is saved, right? That means the query is compiled, and once the query is compiled, the SQL the query execution plan is generated, and that query execution plan is saved in the database, right? And whenever you call the storage procedure, simply, right, it is not going to compile the storage procedure again and again, right? Because it is already compiled. It is not going to generate the execution plan again and again, because the execution plan is already generated and saved, right? So what exactly it will do? It will just take the execution plan, and using that execution plan, it is going to execute the storage procedure, right? So this is nothing but your storage procedure. What is storage procedure? It is a database object which contains pre-compiled SQL queries, right? Pre-compiled SQL query means what? It is a group of a TSQL statement only, right? In other word, we can say that storage procedure are a block of a code, right? Block of code or block of statements designed to perform a task whenever it is called, right? If you want to learn more about SQL Server storage procedure, please visit my website. I will provide the link, right? So, any question from anyone? What is a storage procedure? Guys,
No.
okay. Then the question that should come to your mind is how to use storage procedure in entity framework, right? As you already discussed, the entity framework automatically build the SQL command for the database based on our queries, right? So if you remember, right, whatever example so far we have discussed, whenever we call the save changes method, based on the entity state, right? Based on the entity state, the context class is going to generate the insert, update, and delete SQL queries. If you are fetching some data, right, using the context object, then it is going to generate the select queries. That means what? That means automatically the context object is going to generate the SQL command based on the database, right? And based on our queries, right? If the database is SQL server, then based on our queries, the entity framework going to generate the insert, update, delete, and select statement, which can be executed on the SQL Server database. If the database is Oracle, then based on the Oracle database and based on our query, it is going to generate the necessary SQL statement. Those are going to be executed on the database, right? And more important, for select query, that is fine, right? But for DML operations, right? It completely depends on the entity state. What is the state of the entity? According to the state of the entity, it is going to generate the insert, update, and delete operations, right? We have already discussed, right? So automatically it is build and execute the SQL queries based on the entity state. Sometimes you do not want to use the auto-generated SQL commands. Instead, you want to use your own defined storage procedure, right? So what exactly happened? You are very good at SQL, right? And very good at SQL. And what exactly happening? That the storage procedure you want to execute a very complex logic, right? Which is very difficult to handle using the .NET LinQ queries, right? So, or you can say in .NET, it's very difficult. What it means, it's not possible, but it's very difficult to manage those things using .NET. So, in that case, what you will choose? Okay, let me create a storage procedure and let me call that storage procedure using the entity framework, right? That means you are having a very complex query which is going to do very complex calculation, right? Storing some data, one table, fetching the data from other table, updating the data in another table. You are using some kind of other mechanisms to store the old data in a different table, right? That means many calculations or operations you are going to perform, right? For that purpose, you want to create a storage procedure, and you want to make sure that the entity framework should go and call that storage procedure to do the operation, right? So it is possible to use the auto-generated insert object selected statements, but also it is also possible that using entity framework you can create your own storage procedure to perform the database CRUD operation, and then you want that storage procedure to be called by the entity framework, right? So this is also possible. So while creating the entity data model, what we need to do, we need to include the storage procedure, and entity framework will create a function instead of an entity in the entity data model for each storage procedure, right? So what exactly it means? It means, so let us understand what exactly it means. So currently you can see we are having few storage procedure, right? So now what is our requirement? Our requirement, we know, or using auto-generated code, right? If we provide the necessary information, right, based on the entity state, based on the query, right, LinQ query, the entity framework can automatically generate the insert, update, delete, and select statement. That is fine. But now we are not going to use the auto-generated code, right? We are not going to tell the entity. We are going to we are not going to tell the entity framework to generate the SQL command for us. What we are going to tell the entity framework, hey, Mr. Entity framework, don't generate the SQL command by yourself. Rather, whatever storage procedure we have, please execute the storage procedures, right? That is what we are going to discuss. Guys, my screen is visible to all of you, or it is only difficult for Vijay Kumar to see my screen?
It's visible.
Visible,
Yeah,
sir.
I'm able to see.
I can't, sir. I can't able to view.
So Vijay, can you rejoin?
I tried 2 times. Let me try once again.
Okay, let me stop this and let me share once more. Okay, I reshare. Now my screen is
Yes, sir.
visible, guys.
Yes, sir. Now it's visible.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Visible, sir.
Okay, fine. So basically, so now what our
It's,
requirement? Yeah,
It's recording.
yeah, it's recording, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's recording. Right? So guys, now what our requirement? We don't want to generate those auto-generated insert, update, delete, and select statement by entity framework. Rather, we will tell entity framework to use our storage procedure. First of all, we should have some storage procedure, right? As you can see, we have created 4 storage procedure. One is for delete command, one is for select command, one is for insert command, and update command as well, right? So let me give you some idea of what exactly those storage procedures are all about. So this is a storage procedure which is going to return some data. What data it is going to return? It is going to return course ID, course name, and the teacher ID from these 2 tables, right? So it is joining the student table with the student course, and then student table with our course table, right? So these are the joining condition is there, and based on the joining condition, based on the student ID, what course he has taken, that information it is going to return. Suppose he is taking 2 courses, that course ID and course name going to return along with whichever teacher is teaching that course, that teacher ID is also going to return by the storage procedure. So this is the storage procedure, and you can consider this is the storage procedure for performing the get operation, right? Insert student, so this is another storage procedure, right? So what exactly this storage procedure is doing? It is taking the standard ID, first name and last name as input parameter, and you can see this is going to create a new student. So creating a new student means what? the student ID is not required as an input parameter, because as you remember that student ID is going to be auto generated, right? We have marked the student ID column as identity. As identity, so while inserting that is not required, so for that purpose you can say I'm only passing these three uh, properties, or you can say these three column values, right? And you can see I'm inserting the data into the student table, and whichever student table data is inserted, what is the generated student ID, right? That is I'm retrieving and returning by using the scope identity column, right? So this is the use of a insert functionality, right? Insert SQL statement, right? And this is your update statement, right? So what exactly the storage procedure it is going to do? It is taking the student information as an input parameter and then updating the student information based on the student ID. So here you have to specify the student ID, which is mandatory, because if student ID is not there, then you cannot update the data. So what you are going to do? You are going to update the student where first name, last name, and standard ID. So you are going to update the student data. And what are the column you are updating? You are updating first name, last name, and standard ID based on the student ID column. So whichever student ID you pass, that student data it is going to update. And this is the simple storage procedure, which is basically going to delete the student information from the student table. Whichever student information you want to delete that student ID you need to pass, and that is going to be deleted from the student table, right? So these are the four storage procedure what we have discussed. Guys, remember, whenever you are returning some data, right? If it is more than uh, one database column, right? So you can see in this case, as you are returning more than one database column, right? So in this case, entity framework will generate a complex type for these properties. And remember, guys, behind the scene, whenever you are adding the storage procedure, for the storage procedure, it is not going to generate any kind of a you can say it is not going to generate entities. Rather, it is going to generate one function for storage procedure. So as we are having four storage procedure, right? So you can see it is going to generate four or you can say four functions, right? So you can check this whether the storage procedure are included in your entity data model or not, right? So if you remember, while inserting, right, while creating the entity data model, we have included this storage procedure and storage procedure. You can verify the same by going to the refresh button, and you can see these four storage procedures are included in our entity data model. Now, if you compare, right, what is if you compare the naming convention, so the naming convention is same, right? Whatever the storage procedure name, you can see SP update student, SP delete student, SP insert student, get SP get course by student ID. You can see exactly the same name, right? Here you can see the name are going to be same. So what exactly entity framework is going to do is it will generate some method, right? Some function with the same name, right? Whatever the name of the storage procedure, using the same name, it is going to generate a function, right? That means as we are having four different storage procedure, so it is going to generate four different storage procedure where it is going to generate the four different method, right? For this four storage procedure, it is going to generate four methods. Where the methods are going to be generated, where the functions are going to be generated, it is going to generated within the context class, right? So guys, don't think that for this storage procedure it is going to generate entities, right? Entities are going to be generated only for tables and views, right? And what are the things you can include? You can include table views, storage procedure, and functions. We have discussed table, we will discuss views, we'll discuss functions. Now we are discussing the storage procedure for tables, right? Whatever table you will see, these are nothing but one entity. See, course standard student, all these things you can find it. Course standard student, right? Student address teacher, right? And this is the view, right? And you will not find these storage procedure here. The storage procedure are not available here. One thing is available, SP get courses by student ID underscore result. What is this means? This is an entity. and this entity is created, right, based on the result of the storage procedure. If you go to the storage procedure, SP get students information by get courses by ID, and you will see it is returning a select statement, right? It is having a select statement which is returning multiple column value, right? Whenever a storage procedure returning multiple column value, right, then what entity framework will do? Entity framework will for storing that result, right? Whatever the result, this storage procedure is going to return to hold that result. It is going to create a more entity, or you can say it is going to create a complex object, and the name of the complex object is going to be like this. So whatever the storage procedure name underscore result, right? Now if you go to the entity data model, you will see SP get result courses by student ID underscore result.cs, and you cannot find the result for delete, insert, and student, because delete and insert, they are not returning any select step, right? So you can see it is not returning anything. It is not returning anything. It is returning, but it's not returning a you can say multiple column value. It is returning a single value. If multiple, then for this it is going to create a complex type. But in this case, it is returning multiple column value. Clear? So whenever a storage procedure returning, right, returning multiple column values, right, then for that storage procedure, it is going to create one entity with by adding underscore result to that storage procedure name. So what is the name of this class? SP get courses by student ID underscore result. And these four storage procedure, what you have seen, these are not created as entity. These are created as uh, functions within your context object, right? So now if you go to the context class, where the context class is available within this context.tt file, right? If you expand this one, right, then somewhere you will find these four storage procedures, right? So you can see this is my delete procedure. You can see this is my SPGet courses by student ID procedure, and you can see this is my insert procedure, and this is my delete storage procedure. So if you are working with an existing project, right, and apart from this a DB set, right, which you know already, what are DB set? DB set are nothing but your entities, and these are going to be created based on your database tables and views, right? We have not discussed views, we will discuss that later, right? But if you are finding some method, right, if you are finding some function within your context object, means these functions are nothing but representing one storage procedure, right? And if you want to know which storage procedure this SP delete student method is calling, just expand that, and you will see that it is calling the SP delete student storage procedure. And for this SP delete student procedure, what is the parameter it required? It required the student ID, right? This is nothing but the parameter name, and from where it is getting the value, it is getting the value uh, from this input parameter, right? So while calling this method, you have to pass the student ID. That value will be passed as a parameter for this student ID property, sorry, for this student ID column. And if you go to the delete method, then you will find student ID as a input parameter. Later, I will show you how to use output parameter and what is the type of this parameter, integer, right? So similarly, we'll check all these methods one by one. So that's clear how entity framework generate the storage procedure, how entity framework generate the functions based on the storage procedures,
Oh,
right?
yes. Yes, sir.
Right. So now, now we'll see some example, and we'll see how we are going to call these four storage procedures one by one, right? So let me start with the select one, right? So this is my select storage procedure. So if you remember, we are having a storage procedure to get the date course information based on the student ID. What is the name of the storage procedure? SP get courses by student ID. This is my stored procedure, and I can directly call that storage procedure using the SP get courses by student ID method, because storage procedure are created as method, right? And if you go to the implementation, right, then you will see that it is taking the student ID as an input parameter and calling that respective storage procedure. And guys, this storage procedure is going to return me some column value, right? And in which complex object these column values are going to be stored, whatever the storage procedure name underscore result. So you can see the return type of this, right? Whatever the data is written by the storage procedure, it is storing that data, right, within this SP get courses by student ID result complex type. So it's nothing but it's going to be a class, right? If you go to the definition, then you will see that within this class, it is having three properties. What are the properties? Course ID, course name, and the teacher ID. Why three? Because if you see this storage procedure, how many columns it is written? So course ID, course name, and the teacher ID. Based on these three columns, it is creating this property by appending and by creating a class and by appending these things, right? Because it is the default naming convention, right? And by looking at this naming convention, you can clearly say that this is a type, right? Which is going to be used with this storage procedure. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right now. So this is the storage procedure, what I'm going to call. I'm not bothering about this thing because these are the auto-generated code, right? You do not need to be worried about this thing. What is your requirement? You just need to call the storage method by passing the value 1. So now if you want to execute that storage procedure, SP get courses by student ID, you just need to call the storage procedure by passing the value whichever the student data you want to fetch. So I want to fetch the student whose ID is 1. So I'm passing the value 1. So now you will see whichever courses is taken by the student, that course information it is going to return. So it is going to return as a collection, right? So whenever you are calling the storage procedure return data always in the form of a collection, whether it's it returning a single scalar value or it is returning a multiple column value, right? Always the return data is going to be in the form of a collection, right? So if you want to fetch the data, right, so you have to use a for each loop, right? So I'm using this for each loop. I'm fetching each course information from this courses collection and storing inside this variable because I know this storage procedure returning this kind of data, right? So I can fetch the course ID, course name, and the teacher ID, right? Now, if you run the application, right, then you will see whatever the database script generated by the context object that you can see here and the rest of the things, you know. And in this case, you will see that it is just calling the storage procedure by passing the value 1, right? And if you look at the SQL script generated by the context class, it is just calling this storage procedure, right? And while calling the storage procedure, it is passing the student ID value 1. And the data is written. And in this case, this course student ID 1 taking 2 courses, right? And that course information is displayed here. Clear, guys, how to call this storage procedure using entity framework, which is returning some data,
Yes.
right? And to store the data from the database, right? And to fetch the data from the database and populating this collection, right? It is using what? SQL data reader. And you know what already from the edu.net point of view, what is the use of a SQL data reader? What is the use of a SQL data adapter, right? You know all these things, right? No need to explain what is
Yes.
SQL data reader, right? It is basically going to read the data, right, in a forward only manner from the database, right? And in this case, that concept it is using internally to paste the data and populate the property, right? So this is what this is how you can use the select storage procedure, right, which is going to return some data, right? Now if you look at the insert storage procedure, right, now let me show you how to use the insert storage procedure. Insert storage procedure means you need to create one object, right? You need to create one student object, right? So for that, what storage procedure we have created? We have created SP insert student, right? So, and how many parameters this insert student storage procedure is taking? It is taking 3 parameters. First one is the student ID, then first name, then last name, and then it is inserting the data into the database, and whatever the student ID is inserted, that is going to be returned, right? So in this case, I'm just going to call the SP insert student storage procedure on the context object, right? Let me go to the definition of this method, right? And you can see it is taking 3 parameters, right? So it is taking 3 parameters: standard ID, first name, and the last name, right? So it is taking it is checking the standard ID. Is it has any value? If it is having any value, let's set that value for this property. And what is the type of this property? Sorry, for this column, database column, and what is the type? Integer, right? What is the type? String. What is the type? String, right? So once it has these 3 parameters, right, then it is calling that SP insert student storage procedure, and it is passing those 3 parameters as well, right? So you can see these are the parameters and these are the SP, right? And it is calling this execute function on the object context, right? So once it call this method, right, it is going to return me some scope identity, so a student ID, and in this case it's a integer value, right? If you go to the definition, then you will see it is showing decimal, because decimal can also handle the integer values, right? So that information, right, it is going to store here. But as I mentioned, always it is returning the data in the form of a collection, so directly you cannot access. So how you are going to access? By using a for each loop, right? In this case, this loop will be executed only once, and that student ID, what is generated in the database, that student information you can see here, right? So currently I have restored the database yesterday, right? Because there are many unwanted data, right? So you can see currently this database is having 4 records, right? So now once I run this application, it should display the student ID as 5, right? Let me, and guys, you can also see what database script is generated by using this statement, right? So let me run the application. So you can see the newly generated student ID is 5, right? As expected, one database entry is there, and you can see that Pranay Raut with standard ID 1 is inserted into the database, right? And what SQL script is generated? It is just calling the storage procedure, right? And while calling, it is passing the standard ID, first name, and the last name property value, right? Again, it is using SQL data reader to retrieve the data, what is the storage procedure is returning. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So this is how you can perform this operation. Next, I'm going to show you how to perform the update operation, right? So there is a storage procedure to perform the update operation, right? And what is the name? SP student update, right? So if you check, there is a storage procedure SP update student. This is taking 4 parameters: student ID, standard ID, first name, last name. Based on the student ID, it is updating the first name, last name, and standard ID values. And this storage procedure does not return anything, right? Now, if you go to this update student storage procedure, right? So you can see this is the student ID, standard ID, first name, and a last name, right? Student ID parameter, student ID, standard ID, first name, and last name parameter. It is checking whether this property is having value. If value, then setting the value with the appropriate parameter, and then finally it is calling the storage procedure by passing the 4 parameter. Now you can see it is not returning any data, right? But here you can see this is the integer value. So what this integer value, I will show you, right? And then you can see I'm storing that integer result here and SP update student here, right? Let me run the application. Right. So SP update student 1. 1 means what? It is going to return the number of records are updated, right? The number of records are updated, that count it is going to return in this case. right? And how many records? One record. So that information you can print here. Clear? Guys?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, now finally what I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you how you can delete, right? For that purpose, simply what you need to do, you just need to call the delete storage procedure by passing the value 1, right? So I'm going to delete the student whose ID is 5, right? So in this case, the newly record, right? The newly inserted data is 5. That information I want to delete. Simply call this a delete student student procedure by passing the value 5. Now, if the operation successful, it is going to return me 1. So it is returning me 1 means the database operation is successful. Clear, guys? How you can perform the insert, update, delete, and select operations using storage procedure,
Yes.
right? But guys, one more thing that we need to remember while working with storage procedure, sometimes, right, the storage procedure might be some output parameter, right? And currently we do not have any storage procedure which is taking some output parameter, right? Let me show you how you can work with storage procedure which is taking some output parameter, right? So let me create a new storage procedure, right? So I'm creating a storage procedure with the name sp create student, and this storage procedure taking some input parameter as well as output parameter, right? So you know what is the use of a input and output input parameter are bringing value into the method, and output parameter means they are taking the output, taking the value after the execution of the method, right? So in this case you can consider this is a method. So these 3 parameters will bring values to this storage procedure, and after the execution of the storage procedure, this parameter will take the value from the storage procedure. So you have to pass these values, and the fourth one is nothing but you have to set the value of this parameter, right? So you can see I'm inserting the data into the student table, and whatever the data I'm storing inside this parameter, right? Student ID parameter, right? Now let me run this statement, not in the master. So where I need to execute this one, entity framework. Okay, I have executed the storage procedure. So once you execute the storage procedure, then the second thing is that you need to include that storage procedure. How you are going to include? Can anybody tell me the steps how to include a newly added the table view or storage procedure? What are the steps that I need to follow?
Right click, update from the model.
Right click, update from the model, then
And then we have to open the stored procedure
okay.
and we have to click that.
Right? And while clicking the storage procedure, this is the important section. Import selected storage procedure function into the entity model. This checkbox should be selected, right? So I have selected the newly created storage procedure, and I have checked this, or by default it is checked. So I'm not going to uncheck this one. And once you check, click on the finish button, right? So once you click on the finish button, right, then what it will do, it will create a new function, right, where it is going to create the new function inside your context class, right? Once you check, guys, you can see this is there is a star mark inside your EDMX, means this EDMX is modified. Once you save, then the changes is going to take effect, right? I save this one, right? Once I save this one, right, one pop-up will open and will ask me, do you want to make changes, right? Then I just need to click the yes, right? Let me wait for some time. Once the EDMX file is yes. So you can see the pop-up is open, right? What is saying, the file has been changed externally and has no unset changes inside. Do you want to reload? Yes. Just click on yes to all, right? Once you click on this yes to all button, right, then you will go, then you come to this context class, and you can see that newly created storage procedure here, right? So you can see this is my student ID, first name, last name, and this is my standard ID, first name, last name, and student ID. What is the name of the storage procedure? It is same as the name of the sorry, what is the name of the function? Means it's the same name as the storage procedure. sp create student is the storage procedure name. So here it is creating sp create student as the function name, right? So it is checking the standard ID first name and last name column value, but it is not checking the student ID value. Why? Because student ID value we are not going to pass. We are going to receive that value. So this is the reason why you can see it is not receiving the student ID value, right? But while calling the storage procedure, it is passing that parameter, right? So you can see in this case, you can see, and one more thing, guys, while you have to remember student ID type is integer, first name, last name, type is string. But what is the type of the student ID parameter? In this case, object parameter. So the point that you need to remember while you are passing some output kind of a variable using entity framework to a storage procedure, then the entity framework is going to create the output parameter type as object parameter, right? And then by using the value property, you can access the value of what is stored inside this variable, right? And simply you just need to call the storage procedure and by passing all these parameters, right? So this is fine. But how we can fetch the data from what is retrieved from the storage procedure, right? So let me show you, right? So in this case, you just need to call the sp create student storage procedure, and in this case, first one is the standard ID, first name and a last name, right? But the fourth one, as you can see, the fourth one is a parameter of which type? Object parameter. So first of all, I need to create one object parameter, and in object parameter, you need to specify the parameter name for which this is going to be mapped, right? And in this case, what is the parameter name? Student ID. So you have to specify student ID and type is integer, and then you just need to pass that as a parameter, right? And how to retrieve the value? By calling the value property, right? Output parameter, that value means whatever the value set by this stored inside this parameter by the storage procedure, right? That value you can get by calling the value property. And this is the statement you know very well, right? If you want to log whatever the database script generated by the console object on the context object on the console window, you have to write this statement. Right now, let me run the application. Right, so this is the storage procedure, and you can see it is passing standard ID, first name, last name, and student ID. And for student ID, it is passing the value null. Why? Because its direction is a output, right? And whatever the standard ID, student ID generated, that you can see here, it is 6. And you can achieve by using the value property. Clear, guys?
Yes.
So this is how you are going to work with storage procedure using entity framework. You can use storage procedure without parameter, with input parameter, with output parameter, using both input and output parameter. You can return a single value. You can return a table of values, right? Everything is possible using entity framework. And in this case, actually this makes your work very easy, right? So in this case, you are not interested for anything, right? You do not need to write any kind of queries to get or set the data. You just need to call the method. And this method will take the responsibility of communicating with the database, executing with the storage procedure, fetching the data, uh, populating the data, everything, right? And you as a developer just need to call this method. Clear, guys? Any question from anyone?
No.
Right? So this is how you are going to work with the storage procedure right now. Now we are going to discuss how to work with the storage procedure, right? So if you go to the ADMX file, right? And if you go to the entity object model from the database, right? So you can say this third checkbox, it is nothing but storage procedure and functions. So how to also, we have seen how to work with the tables. We have seen how to work with the storage procedure. Let us move further and try to understand how to work with storage functions, right? So this function, say whatever I'm showing you, this function means this is not your .NET function. This is the function which is generated in the database, how you can use those functions inside your .NET application. That is what we are going to discuss, right? So can anybody tell me what is a function in database or SQL Server?
There are two types of functions in database. One will be the scalar and one will be the tabular. The scalar function will return a single value and the table valued function will return a table of records.
Yeah, that is fine.
And
That is the type of functions. I'm not asking about type of functions. Whatever you are saying, that is the types, right? But first of all, you need to understand what is a function.
It is just like a C# function which is going to execute some block of SQL queries and return the output.
Some of the SQL query means what kind of SQL query you can execute. Can I execute
Select query.
Can I execute some insert statement within a function?
No, we cannot.
So only select statement are allowed, right?
Right.
So basically it's also a database object, or you can say it's a sub program, right? And basically it is going to perform a complex calculations, right? So if you are going for insert, update, delete kind of functionality, then you cannot use function. Function means it is only going to do some complex of calculations, and at the end of the calculation, it is going to return some data, right? So if you, it is mandatory, right? If you are creating a function means it should return some data. And there is no chance that I'm calling a function which is not returning me anything, right? Unlike storage procedure. In storage procedure, you can write insert, update, delete, select statement. The storage procedure can take input, output parameter. In this case, no output parameter, only input parameter, right? Storage procedure, it might be possible to return the data. It might not be possible to return data. If you are not interested, you cannot return the data. But function means taking parameter is optional, but always it is going to return some data. That is mandatory, right? So a function in a SQL Server is a sub program, or you can say it's a database object, right? That is used to perform an action. Action in the sense it is going to do some kind of calculations, right? Complex operations, right? And then return the result as a value, right? There are two types of function. One is system defined function and another one is user defined function. The function which is already defined by the SQL Server, right? Those are called as a system defined. And as a developer, as a programmer, if we are defining the function, then that is called user defined function, right? Some function takes parameters, do processing and return the result, right? If I'm using this is select square, so this is a user defined or system defined function. This is a system defined function. If I call this function, it is going to return me 9, right? And some of the function, and in this case, the function taking some input and returning me some data, right? And some of the function doesn't take any input, but going to return some data, right? So in this case, you can see I'm using the get function and it is going to return me the current date time, right? So what it means a function taking a parameter is optional, but a function should always return a value that is mandatory. Clear? If you are using a
Yes.
function, passing parameter is optional, but always return a value that is mandatory. If you are creating a function means it should return a value. If no return means you cannot create a function, right? So now there are two types. So we are not interested with the system defined functions. So we are interested in user defined functions, right? So in SQL Server, we can create two types of functions, right? One is scalar valued function, one is table valued function, right? So if you compare this thing with your .NET, right? What is integer, character, float? Those are primitive data type. Means how many value they can store? Guys,
Only one.
only one value. And if I'm creating a complex type like student, then inside that student type, can I define, can I store multiple values?
Yes.
Right? So same thing is here. Scalar value function means if you are going to return a single value, or if the user defined function which is return a single value, right? That said to be a scalar value function. if you are returning a multiple values, column of values, right? If you are returning a table, that is table value function. Again, the table value function is classified into two types. One is inline table value function, another one is multi-statement table value function. So we will see three different examples, one using scalar value function, one using inline table value function, one is multi-statement table value function. What is inline, what is multi-statement, we will discuss after some time. Let us start discussing with the scalar value function. The user-defined function which returns only a single value, that is a scalar value known as scalar value function. The scalar value function may or may not have parameters that optional. If you are creating a scalar value function, it might be take some parameter, it might not be take some parameter, that is optional, but always return a single value that is mandatory. And in this case, what kind of value you can return? You can return any kind of data type value, except you cannot return text and text image cursor and a timestamp. Apart from this data type, you can return any other data type. Let us create a function, right? So let me create a function. So in this case, see why I'm saying return type is mandatory, because while creating the function, you have to specify the return type. Without this return statement, right, you cannot create a function. So in this case, this function doesn't take any parameter. And what is the name of the function? Get student count. What this function is going to return integer value. And within the as and begin and end block, you need to define the statements, right? So here I'm creating a variable to store the count, right? And then I'm setting the count variable, right, by executing this statement. This statement is going to return me the number of records, right, that is present inside the student value, and that value will be stored here. And finally, I have to write the return statement where the value I'm going to return. So in this case, I'm going to return the value which is stored inside this student count variable. And what kind of variable is this one? This is a integer variable. So it is going to hold the integer value. And in this case, what type of return type you mentioned, that type of value you can only return from here, right? So as I mentioned, integer in the return statement means you can consider this is nothing but your return type of the function, and this is nothing but your return statement, right? For example, if you understand these things, right? Suppose I'm creating a function, I'm creating static integer some count, right? Some count. If I'm creating the some count function, right? So in this case, can I write like this? So what is this? Guys,
Return type is not a function.
this is the return type. And what is this? This is the actual value that what you are returning from this method, right? And the same thing is, this is nothing but the return type of this function. And this is nothing but your actual value that what you are returning. So in this case, can I type something like this? Integer x equals to 10, right? And then can I write integer x? Is that fine?
Yes.
And in this case, I'm doing the same thing, right? I'm creating this one and a variable, storing the value and returning that variable. So in this case, also some data is going to be returned. So this is nothing but your scalar value user-defined function to return the student count. Let me execute this statement. So once you execute this statement, right, then you will see that it is going to be created inside the functions, right? Inside the functions, there are table value function, there are system value, aggregate, and system function. So this is a scalar value function, so it should be created inside this scalar value functions folder. And what is the name of the function? dbo.getStudentCount. So how to call this function? You have to write a select statement. You have to write the DBO because it is created with using the DBO schema, and you just need to call this method, right? So once you call, it is going to return me hi. Clear, guys?
Clear. Thank you.
Right. So this is one, right? So this is how you can create a scalar value function. Later, I will show you how to use this function, right? So now we are going to discuss some user-defined table value functions, right? In the case of a table value function, we can return a table. So if whenever I'm saying table, you can compare this with a complex type in your SQL in your .NET function. In a .NET function, if you want to return a student data, right, then you have to use the return type as student. If you want to return employee information, then you have to use the return type as employee. Similarly, if you are going to return some table data, right, return a table, then you have to use the table function, right, in a table valued function. Again, these table value functions are created using again, there are two types. One is inline table value function and another is multi-statement table value function. Can anybody tell me what is the difference between these two? What is inline table value function? What is multi-statement table value function? Any idea? So inline table value function means within the function you can write only a single statement. No more than one statement allowed to write inside a inline table value function. In multi-statement table value function, as it is saying multi-statement, that means what? Now more than one statement you can write. The return type is going to be a table, right? That is 100%. But how many statement you can write here? In the inline table value function, only one select statement is allowed. And how many statement allowed in the multi-statement table valued function? The statement itself saying multiple statement you can allow, you can write. Clear? In inline table value function, only one statement is allowed. In multi-statement table value function, multiple statement is allowed to write inside the function. Clear?
Yes.
Right? And let's see how, right? In the case of inline table value function, you do not need to specify the structure of the table. You just need to specify the structure as table, because in this case it is going to generate, it is going to have a single select statement going to be written, right? So as it is not allowing you to write a multiple statement, right, it means it is having only single select statement, right? And whatever the column you are returning from the select statement, accordingly the structure is going to be generated by SQL Server, right? In this case, if I am using select star from student, means what? Means whatever the structure of the student table, student ID, first name, last name, and standard type, standard ID, those four columns are going to be included here. So here you do not need to specify the structure of the table, because in this case it is not allowing you to write multiple statements. So whatever statement you have written, according to the column what you are returning, right, whatever the column you return from the select statement, accordingly the structure is going to be defined. As it is having a single select statement, you do not need to write the begin and end block, right? So a function begin and end is not required here. You can simply write return and your select statement, and here the return type is going to be table. Here you do not need to specify the structure. Clear, guys? This is nothing but your inline table value function, right? Let me execute this change. Okay, so this is an inline table value function. So as it's a table value, so you can consider it's a table, and the way you are accessing the table, in the same way you can access this function, right? Select a star from dbo.get students details by student ID. So I'm passing one and I'm calling the method like this. So now you can see that student information will be shown. Right, so here you do not need to define the structure. The structure is going to be defined by the select statement that what you are writing using the return keyword. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right, and the next one is multi-statement table value function. In the case of a multi-statement table value function, the structure is going to be defined by you. You can write multiple statements, right? And in this case, right, you have to write, as you are writing multiple statement, right? So you have to specify the begin and end block, right? So in this case, you can say return. I'm defining the table, the student table, right? And I'm specifying the structure, student ID, name, student, address. I'm going to return these three columns, right? And the structure is defined by me only, right? And I'm using begin and end. And then I'm inserting data, insert into student table, right? And you know this index, insert into select from, right? This is a SQL Server statement which will fetch the data. So in this case, whatever data is written by the select statement going to be inserted inside this table, right? And you have already defined the structure of the table. What is the structure? The structure is this one, right? If you are new to SQL Server functions, right, then please try to visit some good websites and YouTube videos to learn more about functions in SQL Server, right? So I'm not going to discuss the functions concept in detail, right? There are many things that you need to understand from the functions point of view. I'm not going to cover those things because we are only going to use the function. What is function or how all these things you have to learn from SQL Server, right? So in this case, it is just creating the structure containing three columns, student ID, name and address. So I'm selecting the student ID. I'm selecting a first name as name and I'm casting the address 1, address 2 as your student address, right? And then I'm selecting the student inner join with student address and all these things, right? So I'm creating the multi-statement table value function. It is and you can also access the multi-statement table value function, right? The way you are accessing the. So in this case, you do not need to pass any parameter because it is not taking any parameter. You just need to call this function, right? So it is going to return all the student data, right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
So you might be have one question, sir. In our student table, we are having 5 records, but in this case, it is returning me only 4 records. Can anybody tell me why? What is the reason? To understand the reason, you need to understand the student address table, right? So let me check how many records are there in student address table. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is there any record for the student ID 5? Guys?
No. No.
No. And what I am using here, student inner join student address. So in this case, if there is no matching rows available in the student address table, is that record is going to be retrieved by the inner join?
No.
So inner join means only the matching records which are available in both student and student address table. And in this case, only these 4 records, right? Student ID 1, 2, 3, 4 are available in student and student address table. And this is the reason why when I'm calling this function, I'm only getting these 4 records. Fine, guys.
Yes.
So we have created 3 functions, 1 scalar function and 2 table value functions. But guys, remember, entity framework will going to ignore the scalar value function. Using entity framework, you cannot call a scalar value function. Using scalar value function, you cannot, a scalar value function is going to be simply ignored by the entity framework. And for table value function, it doesn't matter whether it is a multi-statement table value function or whether it is a inline table value function, the entity framework going to create functions for the same, right? And let us understand these things practically. So in this case, let me delete this one. So we have created 3 functions. Now our requirement is we are going to use the functions right from our .NET application, right? And using entity framework. Using entity framework, database first approach means first you need to update the model, right? And in this case, you can see the 3 storage functions what I have created, right? Those are visible in the entity data model. Right? Get all student details, get student start, get student details by student ID. So in this case, get student count, it's a scalar function, and get all student details, get student details by student ID. These are nothing but your table valued function. And you have to make sure this checkbox is selected, otherwise these are not going to be added in the entity data model, right? So once you select this and once you click the finish button, right, it will take some time to add those functions within your ADMX file, right? So let me save this one. So you can see the star button. So once you click the save button, right, it will open one pop-up window. It will ask, do you want to modify the context object? You just need to click the yes to all option. And once you click the yes to all option, right, then you will see those storage procedures are going to be added inside your you can say this is my storage procedure, this is storage procedure, this is storage procedure, and this is storage procedure, and this is storage procedure. Now we have created three functions, but how many functions are included here? We have created three storage function, one scalar and two inline table value function. But how many are included here? Guys,
2.
two. Do you have that scalar function here?
No.
Is returning the count. So scalar function are not going to be supported in entity framework, right? And here you need to understand. So DB function means this is the function name in the database, and using this EFDemoDB entities, it is going to execute this one. So EFDemoDB entities means it is going to give the database information, and this is nothing but your function name, right? So in this case, you can see get all students. So what is the return type? So in this case, it is going to return a select statement. Select statement means it is going to create a complex type. And as we mentioned, like the storage procedure, right? It is also going to create the uh, complex type, right? Based on the result, right? In this get all student details, right? So get all students details, and it is appending underscore result to store the data. And whichever column you are returning, student ID, name, and address. Get all student. What are the column we are returning here? Student ID, name, and a student address. So you can find these three properties here: student ID, name, and student address, right? And for the second one, which is, and in this case it is not taking any parameter, and get student details by student ID, it is taking a parameter. And in this case, right, to store the result, you can see the name as it is, and it is appending some underscore result. And if you go to the definition, then you will see it is having the four properties, right? Why this is having four properties? If you go to this function, right, what I have written, select a star from student means inside the student table, how many columns are there? All the columns are going to be written, right? So in this case, student ID, first name, last name. Student ID, you know, it's a primary key which is never going to be null. So you can say it is integer, and standard ID might be null. So it is making this as a nullable parameter, right? So we have created two students, right? We have having two storage functions, and two functions are created, right? So in this case, it is going to execute this method, right, using this context object, right? EFDemoDB entities. What is EFDemoDB entities? If you go, this is nothing but your context object, right? So we have created two functions. Now we are going to use those functions, right? So let me show you how we can use these functions. Right, so you can see whatever the script generated to show to see I'm using this statement, and here get all student details. So in this case, it is going to return me some get all. So what type of data? Get all student details result, right? So you can also write like this. So get all student results. In this bar, you can simply type like also this. So student ID, name, and student address, these three are the properties that what we are returning. And using this for each loop, you can access all these things, right? Now let me run the application. Right? So this is the statement which is executed, right? So as you know, to call a storage procedure, what statement we require? Select star from dbo.get all student details. So instead of star, so can I write these things? Student ID. Can I write name? And can I write student address? Is this possible? Yes, it is possible, right? So this is the statement to execute the to call this function, right? And the same thing is generated here. So select first one is C1 as C1. That is the unique identifier, unique. To identify each row, it is using C1, then student ID name and the student address, right? And then you can see these are the data. Clear, guys? Clear?
Yes.
Right? So this is how you can call the student address to get all student details method. The next one is another method is there, right? And to call that method, you have to pass the student ID, and that method is going to return you the student details. Get student details by student ID. And if you are sure that this function is going to return me a single object, right? Single data. So you can see the return time is iterable, right? Means it is going to return multiple values, right? Why? Because he doesn't know whether the query what I'm going to execute it is going to return me a single object, a single student details or multiple student details. So it is always going to assume that it is going to return multiple object details like the previous example. But in this case, if you are sure that it is going to return me a single object, then you can call this faster default method, right? And once it return the data, you can print the value student ID, first name, last name, and a standard ID, right? So now run the application and you will get the data as expected, right? So whichever the student ID you passed, in this case, I passed the value as 1. So the student ID 1 information, it is written. Clear?
Yes.
Clear, guys? So this is how you need to work with the storage procedure and storage functions. Any question from anyone? Yes. You understand tables, you understand storage procedure and function. Now we are going to understand the concept called views, how to work with the views. What is a view? Can anybody tell me?
It's a, you can say it's a virtual table.
Yes, it's a virtual table, right? So you can see it's a virtual table, or you can say it is not going to store the data, right? So whenever you query a view, right? So actually, whichever table the view is created, it is going to paste the data from the actual table, right? So you can consider it's like an interface between the user and your data tables, right? Your database table is there, user is there, you have to query the view, and this view is created based on whichever table it is going to fetch the data from those tables. So view in SQL Server are nothing more than compiled SQL query. We can also consider the views as virtual tables. As a virtual table, the view do not store data physically by default, right? By default means what? Now later, if you create some index on the view, that view becomes an indexed view. Index view can store the data. So that is a different story altogether. If you want to know all these things, then you have to learn from SQL Server, right? But for now, view means for us, it's a virtual table which doesn't store any data by default. Whenever we call the view is going to query or fetch the data from the underlying base table for which the view is created, right? So when we query a view, it actually gets the data from the underlying base table, right? So simply we can say view act as an interface between the database table and the user, right? So if you guys remember, we have already created a view in our application, right? If you go to this place, right? So this is our view we have already created, which is going to return me student name, first name, last name, course ID, and course name. From student table, this three information. From student course table, this information. And from the course table, this information we are returning. That means you can see this is student table, student course table, and course table. By joining three different tables, we are returning the data. And this is the beautifulness, this is the advantages of using view. What are the advantages? We'll discuss later, right? But for now, we are having one view which is going to be have a very complex SQL query, and that query result we can access by using this view. Right now, you can access the result of a view just like you call a method, right? In the same, just like you call a table, right? In the same way, you can access the data from a view, right? Now, if I access the view like this, it is going to return me the data, right? So why I'm saying Pranay 2 times, why I'm saying Rohit 2 times, all these 2 times, because there are there are joining with the courses table, student course table, right? And they are having 2 courses, right? If they are having 2 courses, that means 2 records will be written, right? This is what the joining condition what we have provided here, right? So now the view is already created, and if you remember, while creating the EDMX file, we have included that view DBO and view student course. This view we have already included. As we have already included, see, while I'm updating, you can see this option is not visible. In the refresh button, this option you can find. This is the view which is already included, and whichever is already included, you can check those things inside this refresh button, right? That means we have included. And whenever we created a view, it is behavior similar to a what I can say a table, right? As you know, for table, the entity framework going to create an entity. In the same way, for views, the entity framework is also going to create an entity, and the name is going to be same as your view name. What is the name of the view? VW student course. And in this case, you can see this entity is nothing but your VW student course, right? So you can see VW student course. This is your entity. And for this entity, you can see this is the VW student course class is generated. So this is the class, right? So now you might be one question. So why I'm going to create this view? As we know, we are having table. For the table, we can create the class, right? Then what is the use of this view, and what is the difference between the view, the entities which is created based on the table, the entities which is created based on the view, right? Can anybody tell me what is the difference between the entities, right? So if you see, okay, right? So I can create an entity, right? So I can, I'm having an entity, right? I'm creating an entity based on the database table, right? And I can also create an entity, right? Based on the view. What is the difference between these 2 entities? Can anybody tell me? So this is a class. So this is a class. This is also a class. Then what is the difference between these 2? Can anybody tell me?
I think we cannot do any modifications.
Exactly. Exactly. So using this entity, you can perform the CRUD operation, right? You can use the select statement. You can query the data. You can write. You can modify the entity state, right? The based on the entity state, instead of the delete operation is going to be happen. But in this case, right, you can only query the data, right? You can only query the data means you can only the entity framework can only generate the select statement, right? But you cannot perform the DML operations, right? Data modification operation is not possible using that entity which is created based on the views, right? You cannot update, insert, or delete statement. This is not possible, and this is the difference between the entity which is created based on the database table and based on the view. In the interviewer, they might be asking this question: what is the difference between the entities which is generated based on the database table and which is generated based on the database view? The difference is that using entity which is created based on the database table, we can perform the CRUD operation. But using entity which is generated based on the database view, we can only perform the select operation. We cannot perform the insert, update, and delete operation. Clear, guys? Clear?
Yes.
Right? So now we are having the student entity, view student course entity, and now we are going to see how we can perform the select operation, right? First of all, it is not possible to use insert, update, and delete operation. If you try, then what will happen? You will get some kind of a error. That also I will show you, right? Let me go to my application. Okay, it's still saving, right? So now I'm using the view, right? So this is my view context dot view student course dot to list, and here I'm fetching all the data, and whatever the view return, right? That is what first name, last name, and course name I'm printing in the console window, right? Let me run the application. Right, so you can see it is issuing a select statement, and you can see here it is printing the data as expected, right? So now what we are going to do is we have printed the data, and then what I'm doing, I'm using a for each loop, right? And using this for each loop, whatever the data is written by this, I'm just going to update the first name. First name equals to update. First name is going to be updated, right? And then what I'm trying to do, I'm going to call the step changes method. Context dot step changes method, right? And to see what exactly the error, what I can do, I can put this block inside my try catch, right? So I'm putting these things inside my try block, and inside the catch block, what I'm trying to do, I'm using ex, and here I'm ex dot message, right? So now if you see here, I'm updating each entity. Each entity is updated means what? The entity change, state is changed to what? Modified. And whenever I'm calling this changes method, right, then it should generate the update SQL statement. But as you know, this is a view, and a view you cannot perform the update operation. The select operation is fine, but update operation is not fine, right? Let me run this application and see what happens, right? So what he is saying, unable to update the entity state because it has a defining query and no update function element exists in the modification function to support the current operation. So unable to update the entity state is because it doesn't have any update function. And this is because it's a view, and on view you can only perform the select operation. You cannot perform the update operation, insert operation, and delete operations. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So that's it for today. And in the next session, we are going to discuss how to implement the transactions, right? So in this, how to implement transactions using entity framework, how you can do some kind of entity validations, right? Entity validations in the sense, if you are having one student entity, right? And while entering the data, if you want to provide some validation that the first name should not be null, the last name should not be null, right? Then how you can do these things, right? That is what we are going to discuss tomorrow. And with that, our entity framework database first approach is going to be complete. Clear? Any question from anyone?
So just one question.
Yes.
Like when we say class and entity, so the difference is like class is that we created out of
See, class means this is a class, right? We can consider this class as an entity when it is going to be included as a property in the context class using the division, right? If you see this course, it's if you go to the definition, it's a class. But I can also call this class as entity whenever I include this as a division property inside my context class.
Okay.
Right? And whenever I'm saying it's an entity means it should pointing to some database table.
Okay, so which is the class which is generated out of database table is called as entity.
Sorry,
The
can you
the class which is generated out of the database table.
out of the database table means what?
I mean, like we mapped it using that context. We have that
See, if
database
you
and
see,
created.
simply, if you are creating a class, and if this class is not included as a DB set property in the context class, then it is not an entity. If it is included as a DB set property in the context class, then it is an entity. And if you are including means it is having some mapping information. It should map to some database table, right?
Yeah.
If it is not mapped, then why you should include that inside this? And if it doesn't have any corresponding mapping table, then whenever you paste these courses, then what data it is going to return? From where it is going to return the data?
Okay. Okay. Got it. So entity means there is a corresponding database table to which it is mapping.
So don't say the corresponding database table. In this case, do you have any view student course corresponding database table?
But it is referring to a table, no? So that we
No,
also
it is referring to some database object, right? In this case, it is referring to a course. A course means in this case, it is referring to a database table. In this case, it is referring to a database view, right? So
okay.
instead of saying database table, you can say database object, right? From
Okay.
where it can paste the data.
Okay.
Right, guys? Any question from anyone else? Okay, fine. So guys, tomorrow we are going to complete this entity framework concept, right? And then from Monday, if possible, we are going to start the code first approach. Code first approach will not be that difficult if you understand this entity class. If you know how to create the entity class, right? What is the use of this DB context, right? What is the constructor is doing, right? And this on model creating, I have not explained that. I will explain in the code first approach, right? And if you want to know what is the, if you know what is the DB set and what exactly the name, right? To which database table it is pointing to, right? And if you know how to create the storage procedure, storage functions, right? Then understanding the code first approach is that not that difficult, right? If you understand these things, right? Okay, we will see everything in detail. Right. For now, just keep focus on this entity framework database first approach, and please try to solve the problem. Right. Try to do practices. Until and unless you are not doing practices, then it will not be. I mean, what I can say, you will not understand the concept very clearly. Right. So, can anyone try that asynchronous version of what we discussed in the last class?
No, I will try in weekend.
So you have not tried, right?
Right. In weekend I will do.
Yeah, sure. But try it, because see why I'm saying, because asynchronous version is very important, right? If you are developing some real-time application, then you will see most of the time whatever API you are developing, and you can see all the API are going to be async API, right? So you should understand the asynchronous programming very well, right? Because asynchronous programming, you can consider it is one of the mandatory thing nowadays for .NET app developers, right? If you are working as a API developer, then asynchronous is mandatory, and you should know what how exactly it is working, how exactly it is executing the query asynchronously in the database, right? Whether I need to go with asynchronous programming or not, whether I need to execute the query asynchronously or not, right? So those things you should know. And once you know the thing, then you can take the decision whether you need to implement the thing or not while designing your application. Okay. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.